Hello, everybody. This is part two for class for the week of April 20th through the 24th. Let's look at the other two readings today related to the question of how religion shapes political culture, for better or worse. Let's have a look at Francis Schaeffer in his chapter from his book, The Christian Manifesto. The title says it all, right? And then let's look at the other reading from Sam Harris and his argument for the new atheism, as it was called, from back in the 2000s. So yeah, again, religion and how it shapes political culture. We talked about the Scopes trial last time, and that great debate, a great standoff, as it's frequently portrayed, between science and religion. And I pointed out there was more going on in the 1920s than we often realize. But still, what is the current status of the way people understand the origins of human beings today, or at least since about 1983? It's been a pretty even toss-up between those who take two pretty stark extremes. Either humans evolved with God guiding somehow, or God created them in their present form, period, right? And then there's sort of a third option that loses out, that humans evolved, but God had no part in the process. That one is certainly gaining traction in recent years, but it's still the lesser position. So yeah, the way that we understand our own nature in relation to God is this really stark debate. And I think William Jennings Bryan understood that quite well back in the 1920s. And it's still pretty true today that you're looking at these two distinct extremes. One thing that's very interesting, though, that's changed since the time of the Scopes trial and that era of fundamentalist Christianity is that we've seen the rise of creation science. And you hear a lot about this, and we'll come back to it next week when we talk about some of these Supreme Court cases that actually dealt with it. But yeah, what is creationism? It's not quite the same thing. It's actually not at all, I would say, the same thing as we saw from William Jennings Bryan, that religion has this very important pragmatic value for democracy. Since that time, around about the late 1970s, you saw the rise of creationism that took a serious look at natural science as it was understood and really made the argument that there really is an argument to be made for creation by God, or something like God at least. And so a whole bunch of books came out late 70s, early 80s, making this claim. And of course, it was pretty roundly dismissed by the mainstream scientific community, and as we'll see next week, by the Supreme Court even, as sort of religion masquerading as science, which is especially offensive. Now, again, this isn't at all what William Jennings Bryan argued back at that trial, as far as I know, unless there's something I'm missing. In more recent years, we've seen creationism make this transition to something called intelligent design. William Dembski at Baylor University and a bunch of other people, Michael Behe, propose a more modest idea of creationism that's not so much reconciling the book of Genesis and the 7-day creation we see there with what they see as modern science. Instead, it's just the basic claim that if you look at the natural world, there appears to be a sort of intelligent design behind it. There's a sort of shape to nature and a direction of nature that shows an intention to it that can only be explained by a mind. It's more like philosophy than natural science, but of course it too has been pretty roundly dismissed. There are a few organizations out there that have really kept this going, and one of you is going to present on, but since we're not meeting, I'll do it. Is an outfit called Answers in Genesis. You can visit answersingenesis.org. And they are probably the leading proponent of creationism. They take out these hilarious ads, to our atheist friends, thank God you're wrong, right? It's pretty simple, pretty simple response. But yeah, they indeed perpetuate a great deal of intelligent design as well as just old school creationism. They have a whole set of curriculum for kids. Very, very popular among homeschooling evangelicals and a lot of the private Christian schools around the country. Although it's very interesting, these aren't very popular among Catholics in the Catholic private school system. Catholics have a whole different approach to this kind of thing. They're much more interested in science as a theory, as a step in the history and development of human knowledge, instead of just this final word on everything. And so, yeah, the way that Catholics approach this question is very different from the way Protestants and evangelicals do. I think the simple reason is because Protestants and evangelicals are much more keenly focused on the letter of Scripture, whereas Catholics are not. Answers in Genesis has an ark, a model of Noah's Ark from Genesis. You can visit it at somewhere in Kentucky, I believe. The lead guy behind it, though, is a guy named Ken Ham, and he's been a really strong, consistent proponent of creationism for years and years. And he recently had an interesting debate with Bill Nye. Bill Nye is the big proponent of science and science for its own sake, and no hard feelings toward religion, but it's not science. It's a separate thing. It's distinct. Science itself ought to stand alone, and that means creation science is particularly offensive to him. So yeah, things change a lot since the time of William Jennings Bryan, and the emphasis on the pragmatic value of religion and of the Bible in particular in democratic society. That's not the main argument anymore. Now it's more about creationism confronting science directly. We'll come back to this, like we said, next week as we turn to some of the Supreme Court cases. There's a whole bunch of court cases dealing with religion. But yeah, this time, let's look at some of the other arguments for the need for religion to shape political culture. Francis Schaeffer was a really prominent Christian intellectual of the mid-20th century. And he's best known for a lot of his writings, but also a series of documentaries that he made, 13 parts, in fact, called How Should We Then Live? You can pull them up on YouTube and watch them, where he gives you this broad, sweeping tour of the history of the world and the way that religion is always very present in civilization and the shape civilization in all these fundamental ways. And just historically speaking, you just can't ignore that. And so Schaeffer became immensely popular among evangelicals in the 1970s, especially as we saw evangelicalism kind of branch off on its own away from mainline Protestantism. This is when mainline Protestants started to decline. And also about the time where we saw evangelicalism shaping a great deal of the moral majority that we talked about earlier. So yeah, Francis Schaeffer really is the sort of intellectual founder of the moral majority, and later the Christian right, as we saw with Jerry Falwell and that whole story. However, Schaeffer was a bit disappointed with how it went. By the 1980s, he saw what he hoped would be sort of this cultural renewal, this bringing us back to the spiritual underpinnings of civilization. And instead, it just turned to power politics. You really saw it with Jerry Falwell, right? He was fundamentally concerned about taking back America for his particular brand of Christianity. He was about getting Ronald Reagan elected twice, and all this very immediate, short-sighted approach to religion and politics. That wasn't at all what Schaeffer meant. Schaeffer was much more interested in placing Christianity within this broad 2,000-year complicated, fascinating history. He's very historically minded in his writing in a way that evangelicalism just isn't. Not then, not today. If you look at those mega churches, if you look at a lot of mainstream Christianity today, or really a lot of religion today, at least in the United States, it's not all that interested in history. It's much more interested in religion simply as it exists right now. That just can't work, according to Schaeffer. And he addresses primarily evangelical Christians like himself, but he does mean to remind them we have to think of religion in the flow of history, a broad story of history. He points out that Christians, on page 212, have this tendency to think very much in terms of right now, and they focus on bits and pieces, he says. And you can tell he's very conservative, obviously, but they're worried about society. They're worried about all the little things that upset them. And of course, he takes direct aim at abortion. This is about the time that the Christian right was turning against abortion rights in a way that mainstream Protestants hadn't before, remember. He's concerned about all kinds of immorality in society. He's really speaking that language of the moral majority. But he points out, again, those are bits and pieces. The problem is that all the Christians who are concerned about this are not really thinking about the totality of things. They're not aware of a deep shift in our worldview that happened, that is the root cause of these trends we see in culture and society. And instead of looking at the symptoms, we ought to look at the actual illness. Most of us grow up in a sort of assumption of Christian civilization without realizing how drastically it has actually changed at a very deep level. So we have to really think about what that actually is. And what it is what he calls this phrase that's really popular through the 1980s, secular humanism. It's like atheism, but atheism that sort of shifts all of the emphasis to human beings alone and our reason and our capacity for science and technology. That's what makes us what we are, not our being made in the image of God. No, that's the old worldview that has kind of withered away, and religious people haven't seen it because they just kind of assume religion is just fine the way it is. And meanwhile, this secular humanism that he fears so much has overtaken so much of our culture and our institutions. What is it? He'll explain it here in a minute, but the bottom line is you got to remember these two things are not compatible. These are two fundamentally different worldviews, and they are not just ways of thinking. It's not like, oh, you can just believe what you want in your head. No, they have inevitably different results, he says on page 213. And I really mean inevitably. Ideas have consequences. He says it's not just that they happen to bring forth different results, it is absolutely inevitable that they will bring forth different results. So why haven't people of faith seen this? And here is his indictment of Christianity of his time, speaking in the late 1970s and early 80s. And, it seems pretty robust, right? There's been a lot of revivalism, there's a lot of evangelicalism, the Jesus movement of the 1970s. It's very hip and cool. There's a lot of young people going to summer camps and becoming Christians and all this kind of thing. But no, all of that is great, says Schaeffer, but it misses the point. It's a lot of what he calls pietism, pietistic movements that get people excited about their faith and dedicating their lives to Jesus Christ. That's all good, but it ignores the intellectual side of life. And as a result, it gets completely overtaken by this secular humanism, very subtly. Ideas have a way of overtaking our worldview without even knowing it, Schaeffer insists. It results, though, in a form of faith, as sincere as it is, that's deeply compartmentalized, that's very personalized. People tend to describe their faith very much in terms of a personal experience that's just theirs and theirs alone. It's a very individual kind of thing. Quite different, he says, from a sort of spirituality that encompasses all of life, he says. Page 213 toward the bottom. Aside from these, the lordship of Christ covers all of life and all of life equally, right? It's not just your interpersonal experience that you compartmentalize and you call that my personal faith. No, it's a whole way of looking at the world. Again, it is a world view, not just a personal belief. It's not only that true spirituality covers all of life, but it covers all parts of the spectrum of life equally. And in this sense, there is nothing concerning reality that is not in some way spiritual. It also has a strong tendency, despite all the excitement and fervor, to accept relativism. People, mainstream Christians as he knows them, are much more likely to say that my faith is my personal belief, but it's really only true for me. This is a really common thing in the 1980s. You see this a lot, that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. Truth is a matter of personal self-expression. It's a matter of personal choice, a matter of personal style, but there is no overarching truth in general. And I think that idea has kind of expired today. You would have heard it a lot on American university campuses through the 1980s. Alan Bloom, the famous author of The Closing of the American Mind, observed that all incoming freshmen, he says in the 1980s, believe one fundamental fact, that all truth is relative. And they never question that. They never doubt that. It's a fundamental dogma for them. And that's certainly the world that Schaeffer was in too. I think that's gone though. Today, we are much more likely to think that, no, there are some truths that everybody must accept. That racism, sexism, and homophobia are bad. That social justice is a fundamental obligation of every person. And those are pretty absolute kinds of truths that we hear. But still, Schaeffer was living in a world that was much more overtaken by relativism. He says, though, page 213, when I say Christianity is true, I mean it is true to total reality. You've heard Brian say something like this, right? It's not just the belief of the Christians. No, it's more than that. It's a statement about reality. The total of what is, beginning with the central reality, the objective existence of a personal infinite God, page 214. Christianity is not just a series of truths, but truth, capital T, truth about all of reality, and the holding to that truth intellectually, and then in some poor way living upon that truth, the truth of what is, brings forth not only certain personal results, but also governmental and legal results too. It has direct political consequences, he says, of whether or not you see the world this way. Now, of course, he's speaking primarily to Christians. He himself is exclusively a Christian, but it is an interesting challenge to all modern religious traditions, especially in the context of liberal democracy. Our tendency is to say that religious belief is simply the right of the individual. It's a human right, right? Everybody ought to respect that human right as the choice of the individual to believe it. Religious bigotry is bad, not because it degrades the religion, but because it degrades the person who believes it. And that's kind of the general mantra today. Schaeffer's challenge here is to say, look, shouldn't we back up and think about religion, whether Christianity or whatever kind of religion, as its own thing? And as we'll see, Sam Harris, even though he's an atheist, he presents kind of the same challenge. Don't reduce it to the choice of the individual believer. Recognize it as something that's there whether the believer believes it or not. It's a system. It's a tradition that's passed down across generations and centuries. Shouldn't we consider at least thinking of religion more broadly? We have a strong temptation to not do that. But are we really understanding ourselves well? And are we understanding the way our worldview shapes our culture well by doing that? Let's contrast, though, the way he sees religion as a total worldview with what he calls secular humanism. There's a diagram. I'm pretty sure this is actually taken from his book when it came out in the 1970s. You might disagree, you might agree with the conclusions, but notice that ideas have consequences at least. And that's what Schaeffer really wants to get across. He picks up a book that was written back in 1933, and there's a sequel to it that came out later called The Humanist Manifesto. And it was co-written by a whole bunch of prominent secular humanists of the time who sort of laid out the principles of humanity for its own sake. That what makes human beings great is our reason and our capacity for science and our ability to conquer nature and conquer chance. And so let's consider what that worldview has to say, and let's not dilute ourselves about the fact that it is incompatible. It is truly and deeply incompatible with what 2,000-year-old rich tradition of Christianity actually has to offer. He says on page 214, these things cannot mix, right? Because they are two total worldviews, totally separate worldviews. They are separate entities that cannot be synthesized. And yet, if we look at the story of religion in America, especially with Christianity, we have liberal theology, don't we? And we touched on this before. It was very prominent among Protestant Christianity for many years, as well as liberal Judaism, that, we talked about the statement on liberal Judaism a few weeks ago, that, the Bible has all these very miraculous stories and things that are just totally incompatible with modern science and the true understanding of things. So that means we have to be able to take certain claims within revealed Christianity or revealed Judaism and modify them to fit the modern times. And I realize that nobody really lives by the expectations of these religions anymore, say the liberal theologians. Schaeffer says, no, that's not going to work. Liberal theology inevitably becomes secular humanism and atheism. There's no way to reconcile these two things. He says liberal theology tried to bring forth a mixture soon after the Enlightenment, and it's tried to synthesize these two views right up to our own day. So, we mentioned before the way that so many mainline Protestants embraced Darwinism in the early days, right? It wasn't until the Scopes trial and William Jennings Bryan that anyone thought there might be a conflict. We talked about Walter Rackenbush before and the way that he thought, okay, the actual claims of Christian faith are just kind of unbelievable in the modern world, but that's okay because Christianity works for people. You can adapt it to fit the needs of the modern age and what he calls the social crisis and the social problems of the time. Now, we've learned again and again that just doesn't work. I saw this cartoon before, right? The Descent of the Modernists. What happens when you start questioning some of the basics of Christian faith? The Bible's not infallible. Man is not made in God's image. It's just a downward descent into atheism, right? There's no getting along between religion and secular humanism. One always yields to the other. He talks about Charles Hartshorne and Martin Marty, who try to insist that, look, people of faith can have the same love of humanity as secular humanists and even atheists. Don't we have the same goals of protecting human rights and protecting the environment? Can't we get along on that basis? Yeah, there's crazy fundamentalists out there, but we're not them. No, that just doesn't work, says Schaeffer. And we've learned this just from experience again and again and again. Now, of course, let's clarify here. What do we mean by humanism? Is humanism necessarily a bad thing? Martin Marty is, he says, guilty of mixing up all kinds of terms. There's humanitarianism. That's just service and compassion, right? And that's a good thing in itself. There's also the humanities, the study of literature and philosophy, right? The key components of liberal arts education, like you're getting at Colgate University, right? Including political science. Then there's humanism, though, and that's different because that is about placing man at the center of all things and making him the measure of all things, to quote Protagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher. Now, all that said, Schaeffer backs up and says, look, is there a good kind of humanism? Is there a Christian humanism? Yes, and it's rooted deeply in the Renaissance. Let's take a medieval icon. There's Jesus and Mary, and let's take, I think it's Leonardo da Vinci's famous sketch of Jesus and Mary, as well as John the Baptist and Elizabeth, right? What's different here? Renaissance humanism turned away from the medieval style of understanding the human person as otherworldly. Jesus and Mary look very foreign and strange, and that's how they're supposed to look in the Middle Ages. They're supposed to elevate you in this kind of heavenly vision. Contrast that with the humanism of the Renaissance, where Jesus actually looks like a baby. He's a chubby little baby instead of a little adult. Mary looks like a mom. That's humanism, Schaeffer says. That turn to the inner depth and beauty of the human person. And that's what the Christian humanist embraces. He points out that, Protestant reformers like John Calvin accepted that kind of humanism. And that's a good thing. So he says, bottom of page 215, that, the Christian humanist is open to the rich inner depth and beauty of what it means to be human. And this was a prominent thing in the Renaissance era because, as Michelangelo reminded us, we are made in the image of God. And that is the true greatness of man. That's the only way we can truly understand what's magnificent about us, right? If you try to understand human beings all in their own terms, that's the secular humanism that he's worried about because it's just self-refuting. There's nothing great about human beings all in their own terms. They must be understood as great in light of what they look up to, right? And it's been given to us through the revelation of the Bible and through the great religious traditions of civilization, for everybody, right? We can't say that man is the measure of all things because man by himself doesn't really measure anything. He's just atoms in motion. He's just a material being that has no soul or no higher purpose. It is only religion that shows him that higher purpose. So in that way, he's very much like William Jennings Bryan, right? I think he's thinking more comprehensively about it. Bryan was only concerned about democracy as it existed in the 20s. Schaeffer, though, is thinking much, much more deeply about this in the broad scope of civilization. A few other examples, then, of what humanism means, of the sort of Christian humanism means. Let's take the example of law and the legal tradition that we inherit. The guarantee of habeas corpus, that you will be present at a trial and your guilt or innocence will be judged by your peers. This developed very slowly through the course of medieval England and the Magna Carta. The guarantee of trial by jury, the guarantee of due process, all these things, they come out of this delicate balance that developed over centuries of the form-freedom balance, as he calls it. Formalism, meaning control, government power, the rule of law, on one hand, balanced very carefully with the rights of individual citizens on the other. This is our great legal tradition that we Americans all cherish, even people who came as immigrants. Everybody looks to this expectation. This is, he says, a legacy of the Reformation that gave it greater clarity. He'll come back to that point. But he points out that humanism all by itself, though, is unable to say that because it reduces man, he says on page 217, to even less than his natural finiteness by seeing him only as a complex arrangement of molecules made complex by blind chance. Instead of seeing him as something great who is significant even in his sinning, they see man in his essence only as an intrinsically competitive animal that has no other basic operating principle than natural selection, brought about by the strongest, fittest ending up on top. And they see man as acting in this way both individually and collectively in society. If you understand human beings that way, then what is the rule of law? What is justice? It doesn't really have any basis other than just the preference of society. And he rightly points out, all of our assertions of human dignity are just assertions. If we're just matter in motion, if we're just a product of blind chance, that means anything we say about justice or rights or the dignity of human beings is itself just an expression of brutal force. And that's it. And that means that brutal force could just change its mind tomorrow. And it'll be all about hierarchy and harsh brutality. In fact, he points out there was a very important American figure who understood law exactly this way. That was, of course, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was on the U.S. Supreme Court right up until about 1931, I think it was, when he passed away. Holmes is well known for these very short, pithy opinions of the court. He would frequently uphold all kinds of reform legislation in the states, not because he himself was a reformer. He didn't really believe in progress and progressivism at the time, but more because he believed in the right of the powerful to assert their power. That was it. We mentioned the Supreme Court case last time that upheld the Virginia law that mandated the sterilization of people considered unfit as part of the eugenics program. Holmes was the one who wrote the opinion. He agreed that Virginia had a right to sterilize people who were unfit. So that fit very much with his philosophy of law. What is law? Is it a sense of justice derived from mankind's image of God? No. Law is nothing but the will of the stronger for Holmes, and that's about it. Schaeffer quotes Holmes's famous opening line from The Path of Law that appeared in the Harvard Law Review, American Law Review, where he says that the life of the law has not been logic. Right? There's no reason in law. No, it's been experience. Law is just as political and just as part of the interacting forces of political power as everything else is. Law is a product of evolution and the evolution of society. Or he boiled it down this way in another article that appeared in Harvard Law Review. Law is nothing but the majority vote of the notion that could lick all others. Law is just the idea that asserts itself with the greatest power. So all of our ideas of justice and human rights and all these things are all just made up. There's nothing actually in law that is rooted in nature or some kind of natural justice. He just flatly rejects that. Next year, I might teach the law and society class, and we'll talk about a bunch of Oliver Wendell Holmes and consider this great debate in law. But yeah, Schaeffer points to another figure, though, who has a much greater influence on the trajectory of law, and that's, of course, Henry de Bracton in his famous essay, De Legibus, on law is what it means in Latin, where he points out that, look, back in the Middle Ages, this is like in 1250, back in the Middle Ages, the king, he said, ought to be under the law, and this appears clearly in the analogy of Jesus Christ, whose vice regent on earth he is, the king is. For though many ways were open to him for his infallible redemption of the human race, the true mercy of God chose this most powerful way to destroy the devil's work. And Schaeffer says, look at what he just said here. God didn't conquer the devil with power. He conquered him with justice. And of course, the greatest expression of that justice was Jesus Christ being crucified, right? Wow, what an insight. So too it is with law. We don't understand law, at least not for Bracton. We don't understand law as a matter of power and force, as Holmes would have it. We understand it as justice rooted in the nature of things. That is the deep assumption we find in the Old English common law. That's the assumption we find in Magna Carta. and our whole perception of civil liberties and human rights today. He has this strange claim, though. Here's where Schaeffer kind of loses me, that all of this was given its greatest clarity in the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, John Calvin, and all of that, where the church, where Christian faith finally scraped away all of the incrustations that had been added to the Judeo-Christian worldview. And by that, of course, he means Catholicism, that it was all a bunch of encrusting extra stuff, like barnacles on the bottom of a ship, and it just needed to be scraped away. I don't know where he gets that. If you actually go back and read so many of the Catholic philosophers of law, Thomas Aquinas in particular, there was nothing encrusting about Aquinas's thought. He was very crisp and logical about the nature of law. So I think Schaeffer's a little unfair to Catholicism here. This isn't the same nasty anti-Catholicism that we saw back in the 19th century, but still, I don't know. Schaeffer loses me there, but I'll forgive him. So to sum it all up then, he's very much like Brian on this point, but again, he's thinking much more broadly than just American democracy. He's thinking about the deep worldview that sustains our whole concept of human liberty and human purpose. He says, the humanists pushed for freedom, the last paragraph, but having no Christian consensus to contain it, that freedom leads to chaos, or to slavery under the state, or some elite who govern the state. He's thinking very much of the Soviet Union here. Humanism, with its lack of any final base for values or law, always leads to chaos, right? In return, what do we need to govern society? The rule of law that respects individual rights? No. A rule of law that is authoritarian, able to control the chaos that happens. Right, that's it. If we understand human freedom as aiming at some highest good, great. If we understand it, though, as just chaos, well, the only thing that can govern chaos is power, authoritarianism, totalitarianism. Having produced the sickness, humanism gives more of the same kind of medicine for a cure. With its mistaken concept of final reality, it has no intrinsic reason to be interested in the individual, the human being. Its natural interest is the two collectives, the state and society. So it was with Francis Schaeffer. Now again, this was he's one of the intellectual founders of so much of the Christian right in the 1980s. But as you can tell reading him, this is not at all what happened with the Christian right. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, all those guys, they never talked this way. They just wanted to take back America for God and implement their very religiously informed, very Christian understanding of American politics. And of course, it didn't really last. And Schaeffer himself was, living through the 1980s, was really kind of disappointed and frustrated with the way that so much of this went. But still, you kind of see what he's getting at, this desire for a cultural renewal, the fear that power might be the only thing that governs unless we root our understanding of justice and law back in natural right. So, interesting challenge. He's very aware of the deep connection between how religion shapes civilization and shapes political culture in a very important way. And again, he goes way beyond what William Jennings Bryan said, or even George Doherty. This is way beyond under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, or not teaching evolution in the public schools. He didn't mention evolution at all. Now again, all this might seem very foreign to you, if you don't come from a faith tradition or anything like Schaeffer's, okay. But I think the one great takeaway that he offers is emphasizing classic conservatism, the style of Edmund Burke or Cicero back in ancient Rome. How do we make sense of the present times? We can try to draw from our own reason, but a lot of times our reason itself is a product of the times. We can try to look to our values, understood as individual. I believe in equality. I believe in individual rights. I believe in overcoming bigotry and all that kind of thing. Okay, that's great, but isn't all of that also a part of our times? Schaeffer challenges us to ask, I think, what is it that blinds us the most? What is it that makes us truly ignorant? And it truly is not just our bigoted opinions and that kind of thing, but it is the spirit of our times. We are all products of our time. We live and think and eat, sleep, and breathe, within our times. So that means we need something that is not from our time to guide us into the future. We need tradition. even if it's not our particular tradition, tradition in general. The past is the only thing that can come to the rescue of the present while it tries to make sense of the future. So yeah, he's very Burkean in that sense, and I think that's the real inner value of Schaeffer, whether you accept his religious views or not. One of the other presentations I was going to have one of you do, out in Missouri, there's a little town called Liberal. That's the name of the town. Sleepy little town, like most of these little towns in the Midwest, population 759 people, a lot of farmers. Where does the name come from, though? Liberal, back in the 1880s, meant something really distinct. And liberalism, as we know, the word liberal changes its meaning a lot over time. If you go back to like the American founders era, liberal meant what they were arguing for: limited government. You go back to John Locke, he was a liberal. So today you say liberal and you think, Nancy Pelosi or, the American left. For a brief time, though, in the late 19th century, liberal actually was the same thing as free thinking, free thought, atheism, skepticism, especially toward mainstream religion, a turn to a radical emphasis on human reason alone, a lot of what Francis Schaeffer referred to as secular humanism. Did you know, though, that the town of Liberal, Missouri was actually founded by a whole bunch of these people? Its founder was a guy named G.H. Walzer. And Walzer pulled together a whole bunch of free thought, free thinking liberals and said, why don't we prove to the nation what a community of atheists and unbelievers might look like? And so we put out an ad for an infidel experiment, inviting people to come join this little colony. This kind of thing was really popular in the 1800s, little colonies that tried to prove their way of life. Of course, Mormonism started off this way, and now it's fast becoming a major world religion. Other groups would break off. Upstate New York had a whole bunch of these. But indeed, there were all the religious ones. There was also the non-religious one, Liberal, Missouri. And so all these people gathered from all around, all the infidels and non-believers and skeptics, and they really listened to Walzer's call, and they set up this little town that was what's unusual about the town is that it kept a lot of the same rhythms of life that you found in mainstream 19th century America, which themselves were religious. There was a big meeting hall that looked very much like a church. That's long gone today, but by all accounts, yeah, it looked like a church. It had pews. People would get up and speak, and they would actually sing hymns, if you can believe it. There is one of the hymns that actually comes down to us from the little congregation in Liberal, Missouri. It goes like this. A Song for Liberals, it's called. Nobody knows who wrote it. But we want no counsel from the priests, no bishop's crook and gown, no sanctimonious righteousness, no curse or godly frown. Right? No more of this traditional religion. No, we want no Bibles in the schools, no creeds nor doctrines there. We want no superstitions, tools the children's minds to scare. No, we want right and liberty. We want reason's lamp to try, each word and thought of other men to solve our destiny, I guess. So yeah, they would sing hymns, like songs, like religious songs in these meetings. And adjacent to the church was a school, which was kind of the traditional thing, having like a Sunday school, only instead they would instruct children in non-belief and trusting in science and all this kind of thing. And they had all kinds of meetings to talk about their non-belief. And for a while, it was going pretty well. About 1,000 people congregated, and all the non-believers in the nation at least came to visit. Many came to live, and they were going to show the world that a community based on non-belief was possible. But then a whole bunch of believers started moving in the little town next door. And the response from Walzer was to put up this huge barbed wire fence, right, to try to keep them out of town. Over time, Liberal Missouri found itself falling prey to a lot of the same problems that every community is subject to. Who's going to clean the toilets, right? Who's going to take out the trash? Who's going to be in charge of this or that in terms of community, taking care of the town and things like that? And by the way, where's the food going to come from, right? They just didn't want to farm because most of the non-believers of the time tended to be kind of highly educated. They didn't have a lot of experience growing corn or wheat, and the community very quickly fell apart. You visit today, though, and you can still see some of the original road signs. There's Darwin Street, There's Ingersoll Avenue, named after Robert Ingersoll, a prominent atheist figure in the 19th century. So fascinating place, and it's largely forgotten today. There's a lot of people who've poked around in social and cultural history and discovered the past of liberal Missouri. But yeah, what about atheism? What about non-belief? It has old roots in American history. I mean, certainly, back since the founding era, coming out of the French Enlightenment, there was a great deal of skepticism. Late 19th century, you had Robert Ingersoll, who we mentioned, who was a prominent, very eloquent atheist, who actually ran for president in the 1880s on the Liberal Party ticket. I think the fact that he lost was a large reason for the formation of liberal Missouri. John Dewey, a very prominent American pragmatist, who was also deeply skeptical. Madalyn Murray O'Hair was more of an activist, the American Atheist Organization. The main argument that you heard from a great deal of them, though, was not so much the need for all of society to be atheist, so much as their right to be left alone, their right to be free from religion. We'll talk about some of the later atheists who are very important to the U.S. Supreme Court because they're the ones who bring major lawsuits against school prayer and Bible reading in school and stuff like that. If you want to read up on them, by the way, really fascinating book. Susan Jacoby's book, Freethinkers, is a broad American history of American secularism. And it's a really fascinating romp through all the different styles of atheism and non-belief in the United States. So yeah, conventional atheism is more of just kind of a civil libertarian kind of argument. Just, leave us alone, don't force your religion on us as individuals, and that kind of thing. But then you see a whole new shift toward atheism round about the 2000s. The new atheists, they are called, and there's a bunch of them, but there are four prominent figures. Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most well-known. There was, what's the other guy's name? Christopher Hitchens, who was a longtime popular columnist, but he kind of got on board with the new atheism as well. Daniel Dennett, with the beard, who's a prominent philosopher who joined the new atheists, and of course Sam Harris, who we looked at for today. I find of all of them, Harris is probably the most approachable. He's the best writer. He's probably the most persuasive. So what about Sam Harris? His main point, as you can tell here, is that maybe the question of how religion relates to political culture isn't so much the questions that it answers or the issues that it addresses or the way it shores up morality or confidence in human dignity. Harris, as you can tell, flips it completely around and says, no. What if religion is just bad for a culture? Not the kind of religion, not what religion does, not its functional role. Maybe religion is just harmful to culture, especially a modern culture like ours. Think back to that film clip we opened with last time, where you have the Clarence Darrow character at the Scopes trial saying that, look, every step in human progress means we've got to give something up, right? We learn to fly in the air. That means that birds are going to lose their majesty. We learn to overcome all kinds of obstacles in the natural world. That means that a lot of the grandeur of nature is going to be lost. But hey, that's a trade-off, right? So too with religion. The modern world advances, and at some point we're going to have to pay the price and give up our religion. So here's Sam Harris. It was back in 1925. Here's Sam Harris in 2008, or 2004, I guess, making very much the same claim, that the world has advanced quite rapidly, and let's just look at the obvious, that religion just has no more place. So why is it still here? is Harris's argument. Now consider what's happened here. The older atheists, if you take like Madalyn Murray O'Hair or Robert Ingersoll, the people we just mentioned, they had a tendency to have a certain kinship with liberal Protestants. So in other words, take Robert Ingersoll. Even though he was a total non-believer, he could get along with mainline liberal Protestants because they had a common dislike for Roman Catholics. He was very much involved in the anti-Catholicism of his era. Or take another example, take John Dewey. Dewey himself is quite a non-believer, but still he could appreciate the pragmatic kind of Christianity we saw in Walter Rackenbush. What's happened here? Why can't someone like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or the other new atheists look at the kinds of faith and religion that agree with them in terms of their political desires and their political agenda? It seems pretty clear what's happened here. Evangelicalism doesn't have any common ground to offer any other framework of thinking the way that liberal Protestantism did. It's in a way that kind of reflects the general polarization of society. So, what is the real problem then with religion, according to Harris? The older atheists could agree with more liberal religious people that the fundamentalists are nuts. They're the problem. Harris says, no, no, no. The moderates are just as much of a problem. Moderate expressions of religion are just as bad. And so let's consider what that means. Well, let's look at some of the statistics. He points out, we've looked at some of these graphs before. According to Gallup, 35% of Americans believe that the Bible is the literal and inerrant word of the Creator. Another 48% believe that it's the inspired word of the same, still inerrant. Though, okay, certain passages must be interpreted symbolically to understand what they really mean. Only 17% of Americans remain to doubt that a personal God in his infinite wisdom is likely to have authored the text. Some 46% of Americans take a literal view of creation, 7-day creation in Genesis. So this means that 120 million of us place the Big Bang 25,000 years after the Babylonians and Sumerians learned to brew beer, based on the broader historical record that we know. How is it that people live with this paradox in their mind of what science, and even just history, world history, tells us about human development, and how do we square it with what we actually see in revealed religion? He asks then, how is it, page 420 or 242, how is it that in this one area of our lives, despite all our acceptance of progress and modernity and science and reason, this one area of our lives remains religion? Why? We have convinced ourselves that our beliefs about the world can float entirely free from reason and evidence. His real question in this chapter, though, is what about the religious moderate, the moderate believer? What do we say to them? The one who still subscribes to all the same religious assumptions of their faith in the revealed books of the Bible or the Quran or the church teachings or whatever, and they still accept all of that, and yet they're willing to look at it and deny so much of it because they accept modernity. They are moderate believers. Now, again, for so long, atheists didn't have a problem with the moderate believer, right? Because, okay, they could still accept these common social goals of economic justice, of overcoming the influence of Catholicism and Irish immigration back in the 1800s. But all that's gone for Harris, right? Now, what's the moderate believer? He points out it's someone who is ignorant of the fundamentals of their religion, right? They pick and choose what's in the Bible or the Quran. They like the things they like and they ignore the rest. They don't read the whole Bible. Let's take, for example, the book of Deuteronomy in this passage. These people who say, I believe the whole Bible is the inspired word of God. Okay, how about this passage? If your brother, son of your father or your mother, your son or daughter or spouse who you embrace, or your most intimate friend, whoever, worships false gods, what must you do? You must show him no pity. You must not spare him or conceal his guilt. You must kill him, right? Kill him, and your hand must strike the first blow by putting him to death with the hands of the rest of the people. And of course, the stoning. People must be stoned who worship false gods. This is a very common form of communal execution that you see, not just in the Hebrew Old Testament, but throughout the Old World. This is brutal. This is horrifying. So what do you do if you're a moderate believer? You say, well, that's the part of the Bible I don't really go along with. Harris says, why? Why do you accept the other parts and not that part? What's the point of your religion if you continue to hold on to some things and let go of the parts you don't like that don't fit with modernity? Maybe you ought to let go of all of it. Maybe it all should go. He points out, look, if you take the text as a whole, there's no reason for moderation at all. Page 243 at the top. The only reason anyone is moderate in matters of faith these days is that he has assimilated some of the fruits of the last 2,000 years of human thought, like democratic politics and scientific advancement, concern for human rights, an end to cultural and geographic isolation, all these good things, this progress that we've made with civilization. That's what makes him moderate. Stuck in his mind, though, the religious believer still has something that has absolutely no place, and that's backward, old, traditional faith that is fundamentally contrary to all the progress we've made, right? Just like Clarence Darrow said, you got to pay the price. That's Sam Harris. The doors leading out of scriptural literalism do not open from the inside. He puts it that way. Now, the moderation we see among non-fundamentalists is not some sign that faith itself has evolved. No, this isn't anything that happens within faith. Here's one of the more famous quotes from Sam Harris. You see this all over the place. 243, tell a devout Christian that his wife is cheating on him, or that a frozen yogurt can make him invisible, or he's likely to require as much evidence as anybody else. And to persuade him only, he'll be persuaded only to the extent that you show him the proof. But tell him that the book he keeps by his bed was written by an invisible deity who will punish him with fire and eternity if he fails to accept it, even accept its every incredible claim about the universe. And he seems to require no evidence whatsoever. Why does religion get such a free pass, Harris asks. We'll only believe other things on the basis of evidence and persuasion, but somehow religion is just believed automatically, he says. This just has no place in the modern mind. Religious moderation ought to just yield completely to modernity. We ought to be able to snuff out that last little thing in us that just does not belong. What explains the endurance of religion then? Why does it persist? It's a point that William Jennings Bryan made. No matter what atheism says, religion is still going to endure, right? He points out that, look, we distinguish the good passages from the bad passages. The beautiful passages in the Psalms, all the lovely things that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. We only distinguish those things, though, because we bring the measure of modernity to them. So we throw out Deuteronomy 13, but we keep the Sermon on the Mount. He says, if we better understand the workings of the human mind, then what will happen? Here he turns to his own approach to things as a very atheistic humanist and a proponent of science. Now, if we understand the workings of the human brain, we would undoubtedly discover lawful connections between our states of consciousness, our modes of conduct, and the various ways we use our attention. Here's the real questions. What makes a person happier than another? Why is love more conducive to happiness than hate? Why do we generally prefer beauty to ugliness and order to chaos? Why does it feel so good to smile and laugh? And why do the shared experiences generally bring people closer together? Is the ego an illusion? And if so, what implications does it have for human life? And is there life after death after all? These are the questions that are for a mature science of the mind. These are the questions that we're able to ask and explore and probably answer if we let go of religion. It kind of jumps in the way and tries to answer these questions for us. The problem with moderation, he says, is there's no bulwark between, or moderate religion anyway, there's no bulwark, there's no protection against extremism. Even the most moderate expressions of faith can drift very quickly into the more radical expressions of faith. What's the difference between the moderate Muslim and ISIS, right, or Al-Qaeda? Nothing, says Harris. What's the difference between the moderate evangelical Christian who's a nice guy and all that kind of thing, and the fanatic who will murder you for not believing what he believes? Nothing, says Harris. That the moderates are moderated not from the inside, but from the outside. And they have just as much violence and brutality within them as their extreme versions. Religious moderation is the product, he says, of secular knowledge and scriptural ignorance. Right? It's that combination. It has no bona fides in religious terms, to put it on par with fundamentalism. No, the texts themselves are unequivocal. They are perfect in all their parts. You cannot pick and choose the texts, right? By their light, religious moderation appears to be nothing more than an unwillingness to fully submit to God's law. By failing to live by the letter of the texts while tolerating the irrationality of those who do, religious moderates betray faith and reason equally. Right? They don't live out the fullness of their faith, because if they did, they would live out the violent mandates that come with it. At the same time, they betray reason as well by not following modernity to its full conclusion and rejecting religion completely. Now, moderates refuse then the full possibility of what reason has to offer. Or what does it offer, he says at the bottom of 244? More sophisticated approaches to spirituality, ethics, and building strong communities. More sophisticated approaches? Here you see a glimpse of Harris's snobbery. He truly is a bit of an elite, very much the way that William Jennings Bryan called it. the preferable way, the way of smart people, the more sophisticated approaches. He says religious moderates seem to believe that what we need is not radical insight and innovation in these areas, but a mere delusion of Iron Age philosophy. Rather than bring the full force of our creativity and rationality to bear on the problems of ethics, social cohesion, and even spiritual experience, no, moderns merely ask that we relax our standards of adherence to ancient superstitions and taboos. What other realm of life gets away with this, like religion? Right? Does medicine? No. Medicine depends entirely on medical science. Engineering? Impossible. And here he makes an amazing claim. Not even politics suffers the anachronisms that still dominate our thinking about ethical values and spiritual experience. As a professor of political science, I beg to differ. As anybody who pays attention to politics, like political science majors, wait a second. Maybe he'd backpedal on that statement, having seen the rise of Donald Trump. I don't know. Anyway, but so yeah, progress then demands that we let go of religion. Religion doesn't cause progress, Harris insists. No. Progress demands that we let it all go. But what really makes it hang on? It's a society that embraces diversity. I pulled up the famous doodle from Google and the way that it sort of equates every religious tradition with every alternate lifestyle, with every personal form of self-expression. It's all just a matter of you. And we live in a society that expects tolerance and coexistence, that we all get along, that we respect people who just believe different things because it's a matter of their own individual self-expression. So much like Schaeffer, even though they're looking at this at very opposite ends, they do have kind of the same valuable message here. Recognize that religion is its own thing. Of course, Harris rejects it on those grounds, and someone like Schaeffer embraces it on those grounds, but don't reduce it to just the belief of the individual believer. Don't bow down, he says on page 246, to political correctness that says you've got to just respect everybody's belief. Realize that religions matter regardless of who their believers are. Religion is a powerful force and a devastating force. And if you try to just whittle it down to the individual believer, you're allowing it to hang on and resist the progress that we all know is necessary and must happen. How do we have a healthy and flourishing political culture? For someone like William Jennings Bryan, it must be the place of the Bible and the sort of rejection of anything that challenges scriptural authority as our foundation. For somebody like George Doherty, it must be sort of building up of civil religion against the challenges that would tear it down, especially communism, civil religion that's connected in some way to revealed religion. For someone like Francis Schaeffer, it must be a sense of the 2,000-year history, or 4,000 years in the case of Judaism, the history that shapes the present moment and comes to the rescue of the present from the past. For Sam Harris, it's none of those things. A healthy and vibrant political culture is one that finally lets go of religion completely. Doesn't try to internalize it and privatize it, but just scrapes it away and finishes it off. So now we are unable to turn to science and progress and technology. There's a future worth looking forward to, says Harris. So who's right? The four of these, I think, fit together in a very interesting way, and they all go very different directions with their understanding of what we need in political culture. So I'll throw that question out to you on the discussion forum, and to make that, of course, the quiz, it'll be the same thing. Discussion forum is optional, of course, but in the quiz, ask this question: where do we get a vibrant political culture, and what is religion's role in it? Or does religion have a role at all, as Sam Harris says? And if not, why not? Why can't religion have the same set of social and political priorities as someone like Harris, and we can all work in harmony toward social progress and social justice? Well, what would somebody like Martin Luther King say in the role of religion and civil rights, or something like that? I'll be sure to hear your thoughts. I'll post that right away, and the quiz will be due tomorrow. And next week, at long last, we will turn to the final section, part 4 of the class, where we talk about religion and law. Leaving aside politics, let's look at law. How has the Supreme Court interpreted the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And how has it interpreted the free exercise clause? Congress shall not impinge on free exercise of religion. What has this meant for public expressions of religion? Um, we'll look at the cases. We'll look at the cases in the book as well. Originally, I had 2 weeks planned for this section, but we lost a week, so I had to condense it a little bit. So yeah, read those the 2 chapters in the main book, and then for the following Thursday, read from American Religion, American Politics. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll talk to you all soon.